Hello and welcome to the Student Undergraduate Research Experience at the University of Saskatchewan, the SURE program. My name is Merle Massey and I'm the coordinator of undergraduate research initiatives. With us today we have Jill McMillan, who is the graduate writing specialist at the University of Saskatchewan Library. And she is here with writing help to give us some pro tips and ideas on how to do a good job writing up your literature review. Over to you, Jill.
All right, so I'm always so excited to talk about anything to do with the writing, and writing about literature reviews is certainly something that cuts across all disciplines. So I'm happy to talk about this with you today. Just a quick, not, I don't need to reintroduce myself. Meryl did a great job. But if you ever want to contact me, feel free to send me an email, jill.mcmillan@usask.ca. I'm always very happy to hear from students. Even though my main focus is working with graduate students, I'm also available to help with upper year undergrads as well. And oops, if you're not familiar with some of the writing supports and services available through the library, I just want to feature a few of them here. So if you're ever looking for one-to-one writing support, you can make use of the Writing Help Center. This is a free service available to all USask students, regardless of your program, your year of study, and you can receive feedback either via email or you can book a WebEx appointment. We also have some online resources like the USask Writing Help Guide, and in June there will be a virtual writing retreat and a short workshop series. And we also have a series of weekly virtual write-ins that will continue into the summer months. So if you're ever looking for some activities to stay motivated, or you want to learn more about writing or get more support, do feel free to explore what is on offer through the library.
And those are all
All right.
qualify for sure as well. And Jill and I are going to be running a specific sure writing workshop, a writing retreat in August, just so you know.
Yeah, and we're looking forward to that. So I have a question for you. What do you hope to learn today? What are you hoping to learn about literature reviews during our time together? Why not take a minute or two and pop in your comments in the chat? To just, and if you're still typing, do feel free to continue typing away. I just want to touch on a couple of comments that are coming up. There are some questions or comments around organizing information to reduce rereading and to help also determine what you need to include in the review and what you don't. Some of this was addressed in the last session that I did, which was all about some of the initial steps that are going to go into the literature review, namely around organizing your research. So using a table or matrix, an Excel document, that's something that I would recommend you make use of early on in the research process, so that you're taking notes in order to, in that moment, start determining the likelihood of incorporating that text into your literature review. So if you didn't have a chance to watch the previous session that I did, and if those are some of your questions, I would encourage you to do so. And then in terms of some of the other comments coming in, so we're really looking at some questions around structure, and that is a key focus today. So hopefully you're going to walk away with some really practical tips that you can start implementing right away as you start approaching a literature review. And then in terms of that sense of what to incorporate, that is a decision that you'll have to make as part of your reading process. I think the temptation is, when we are writing a literature review, is that we want to report on every document that we have read because we've put the work into finding it and reading it. But ultimately, what you want to determine is always, what does your reader need to know? And remove any extraneous information. And it might be that you're having a little bit of difficulty determining that. And so your first draft of a literature review might be a little bit longer than it needs to be, because you have incorporated these elements of the research that you did that end up being a little bit extraneous to the main question. And that's where getting feedback from a reader as part of your revision would be really beneficial, because as they're reading through, they might say, well, this is great information, but it doesn't really seem to be related to the main point. So sometimes part of writing is about cutting the writing that we've done, which sometimes feels like a step backwards, but it's actually a very normal part of the writing process. Okay, so let's dive into our focus today. So this is our agenda. We're going to briefly look at the writing process as this holistic sort of cycle. We're going to question the purpose of literature reviews, and then we're really going to focus on strategies for organizing literature reviews, synthesizing information, and signaling critique in order to ensure that your reader understands that you've really considered the research that you're reporting on and that you've interrogated it in a thoughtful way. So when we think about the literature review, it really is this interdependent process. So you're balancing research, analysis, and writing, and all of these have to be managed, and they're very much connected to each other. When we think about the writing process, the temptation is to envision this very nice linear structure where we begin with our initial brainstorming, maybe creating an outline, writing our first draft, doing one or two revisions, polishing through the editing process, and then publishing, submitting it to readers. In reality, the writing process is a little bit more messy, and I think that it's important to recognize this. As much as we can increasingly streamline our approach, especially as we become more and more experienced writing a certain text type, often it's going to require that we move forward and then move back a little bit, keep moving forward, move back a little bit. And in an academic context, sometimes this involves having to go back and do a little bit of additional research because as we're putting our information together, we start noticing themes or trends in the reading that we weren't really cognizant of when we first began the research process, and then we might have to go back to do some more systematic research in order to ensure that we are capturing this narrative in an accurate and robust way. And if you have questions about research, always connect with your liaison or subject librarian. You can just go to the library website, type in your area of study, and up will pop the contact information for who the librarian is that can provide some specialized advice on researching within your field. So navigating more specific databases, for instance. So it's a very, very good resource to make use of that is accessible and free to use. Okay, so now the big question, why write literature reviews? Why do we have to do this other than being told, oh, you have to write a literature review? What purpose do they serve? What are their functions? Why bother in the first place? Let's take a minute or two and contribute in the chat. But yeah, it's something that is going to help us with our learning. It's going to be evidence of that, but more importantly, it's going to help ensure that we know what is currently evolving when we think about the research question or hypothesis that we are investigating. So it's evidence that we're keeping up with the literature and the research, and really it's about immersing ourselves in what's happening. So it's really essential to our own learning. And I like this this expression of framing your thoughts and bowing to ancestors. So it really is an acknowledgement of the work that has gone before and figuring out how, A, does your research question have value? Has it been answered or asked before? And if it hasn't, how does it now situate itself in relation to similar questions that have been asked about this topic or adjacent topics? So it's about trying to figure out what's happening, what has happened, and how does my work fit in to that. So it's really like putting a big puzzle together in a sense. In short, it communicates what is known and not known about your topic. So we're focusing on highlighting consensus, gaps, and debates. So where we have agreement, disagreement, and then a mixture of the two. And it also gives us a sense as to what is of interest to scholars in the field as well. And effectively, we do this in order to shape a context for the work that we are conducting as researchers. So we are situating our questions, our project in this larger conversation in order to provide a justification for its value and its contribution to the field of knowledge. So it's doing a lot of things, isn't it? We're going to look at two options, and there are other options that exist for conceptualizing the structure. But I'm just going to focus on two basic ones because sometimes when you make use of basic structures, they end up actually being very robust because of their simplicity. They fit almost any context when it comes to writing a literature review. So the first one is very much immersed in a sense of narrative. So if you are someone who likes to think along the lines of storytelling, for instance, this might be a structure that appeals to you. And you could just go through and ask and answer this series of questions. And in doing so, you will start to have the shape of a literature review. So you can ask, what inspired my research? How does my research relate to what's been done before? And so this is where you would start to incorporate reference to all of those other studies that you've encountered in your research. Why does my research matter? So really making an argument for its significance. What will my research achieve? And lastly, who will my research impact? So this is a structure that is a little bit more exploratory, but it can be integrated with the next option that we're looking at, that we're going to look at in quite a bit of detail. So our second option is entitled Create a Research Space, commonly known as CARS. And CARS involves only 3 rhetorical moves. We're going to do 3 things. First, we're going to establish the research territory. Then we're going to identify a gap in the research. And then we're going to situate our research in that gap. We're going to claim some space in that unclaimed area. And the reason why we're going to focus on this in quite a bit of detail is because it is so simple that we can apply it to any literature review. And it's also a structure that we see very, very commonly in literature reviews. Once you have awareness of this structure, you will see it in probably more than 80% of the reviews that you read in future. So we're going to look at one example of CARS moves. And as we go through, I'm going to ask that you look to see where these moves are being made. So we're going to be looking at how are they establishing the research territory? So how are they asking this question of what's already been done? How are they identifying the gap or identifying what hasn't been done? And how are they occupying that gap? How are they situating their own project? So the topic that we're going to investigate is that of a plant and its value for cultivation. I'm posing a simplified version of the research question. Can this hardy plant, as pictured, which is the Jerusalem artichoke, can it be exploited as a food source for sheep? Okay, this is what we're going to be looking at. So my question to you If we have this guiding question, what additional questions might we need to ask as we undertake a literature review? Let's take a minute or two and contribute in the chat. A range of really great questions coming in. And can I just say how awesome it is that people are willing to engage with a topic that they've probably never previously given thought to. So just thank you so much for your willingness to engage with this kind of activity. So we're looking at questions of, well, do other animals eat this? What are the properties of this plant? Where can we cultivate it? How is it cultivated? How long does it take to grow? Is it safe for animals to eat? What other research has been done on this issue? I think we've captured most of those. Is it currently used for sheep or other animals? So these are all really fantastic questions that we would have to start asking ourselves in order to start crafting our literature review. So we might ask, first of all, why do we need to ask this question? What is prompting this question in the first place? And I think that's always a good step to take, is to query why we are asking any sort of research question in the first place. What problem are we attempting to solve? What is already known about this plant? Does this plant provide adequate nutrition? What do we still need to investigate? So I won't keep you in suspense. Someone has written on this topic. Someone has published on this. So here we have part of a literature review. Just for space, I have removed some detail, but this is part of a published review. And I want you to take some time, read through it, and start responding to this question of how the authors have made use of cars' moves. So let's take 3 to 4 minutes, a little bit more if necessary, read through and start identifying where you see some of those cars' moves in this piece of text. We have some really great contributions coming through. And what we're going to do is go through this a little bit more in a little bit more detail to really break down this piece of text so that we can see, well, how is it so obvious that these moves are being made? Why is it that we can start seeing this pattern emerge? So what we see is language is helping to frame this, this investigation for us. So I've highlighted in red this broad recognition of what is currently known. This is that overall research territory. We have a sense of what a lot of other researchers have been investigating, and it's been placed in a particular context, right? We have this issue with climate change that is going to inspire the investigation of new ways of maintaining food production. And so having to think beyond what is conventionally used for feeding animals. So we've situated the importance of the topic in relation to that bigger context, and then we are filling in what is known about this plant and how it is currently used as a food source, both for sheep and for other animals. But as much as there has been quite a bit of research done looking at this topic, there's still more information to be discovered. And so we have this research gap that is identified. And we have this gap that is framed through some vocabulary, reference to scarce information, for instance. This is a way to really signal to readers, hey, we don't know something. We're just framing it in a more formal way. But essentially, what we're doing is alerting our readers that despite all this other stuff that is known, we still have questions. There are still a lot of unanswered questions. And guess what? We are going to ask and answer one of those questions in the context of this paper. And we are situating our work. We are starting to occupy that gap of knowledge and positioning our work as something that is helping to address that need and push um, the academic conversation forward a little bit more. So this structure is so commonly used, and it's something that you can employ when you are drafting your own literature review. What's really nice is it creates a frame for showcasing the work of other scholars while recognizing that it really is an introduction to the work that you are doing, and providing a justification for the work that you are doing. Okay, so when we talk about literature reviews, beyond that broad overall structure when it comes to the literature review, I also want to encourage you to think about your research from a thematic perspective. So when we're thinking about organization, as you are brainstorming and outlining and drafting, you're going to be thinking about organization. And the reason why we think about organization and structure is to showcase our ideas in a specific way to our reader. And as we're putting this information together, we want to ask ourselves, what does my reader need? And how am I going to meet this need for them? So what information do they should I expect that they already have? What information will be new to them? What sort of contextual information will they require? So when it comes to structuring our literature reviews, we would probably fall into one of three options. A chronological perspective, where we are things have evolved over time. A thematic perspective, where we are grouping like with like, or a methodological focus where we are really comparing how people have investigated comparable questions. Now, realistically, often we might have one of these be dominant, but there will be a hybrid element where we pull in influence from these other structures, and that is quite commonplace. Our focus today will be on thinking thematically, simply because this tends to be a preferred approach. And one of the reasons why it's so nice is that it also helps to encourage analysis. Because as you are making those decisions about how these how studies relate along common themes, you're also going to be interrogating them a little bit more closely. Because if you have four studies, for instance, that are all focused on a similar idea, but one of those studies actually has quite a different argument, even though they're still looking at this a similar issue, then you can put that one in contrast with the three studies that are in agreement. And in doing so, you're starting to demonstrate your awareness of the complexity of the academic conversation. And you'll also be encouraged to make a decision as to which interpretation or which finding you think has more strength and value. And so you're going to be able to demonstrate your own analysis as a researcher more easily. The reason we're going to really emphasize this focus of organizing thematically is because it's a very common pitfall to rely on simple summary when structuring a review, where you have done a ton of fantastic research, but then as you're putting it together, it's just sort of one summary of a study after another, and they're not really speaking to each other. So let's look at an example of this. Oh, I might have given away the plot a little bit. So here we have an example of this sort of structure. And I would ask, what do you think is a limitation of this approach? So let's take 2 or 3 minutes, read through and contribute in the chat box. What do you identify as 1 or 2 limitations of this sort of structure? So we have a couple of comments coming in. And they're all very valid criticisms, I think. So we don't have a sense of flow, and frankly, it's probably quite boring to read. As we're going through, we just don't really have that sense of direction, a sense of context or research focus. We don't really know what this is leading up to. How is it leading up to some sort of gap of knowledge? And ultimately, we're sort of left wondering, why do we care about all of this? Because right now, this review is following just a very basic chronological structure, right? We have that sense of organization moving from 1986 to 2008, but maybe there's an implied development of knowledge simply because people have continued to research this topic, but we don't really have a sense of that dynamic investigation. And as a result, as readers, we become quite disengaged and are probably just starting to skim through, frankly, as we progress. We're not really looking for much detail anymore because it hasn't engaged us. It's really not adding any value for us. We would have been better off going to those original studies and reading the original studies ourselves. The writer who has put this together hasn't added any new information for us. They haven't made any connections for us. And as a consequence, we might even feel that, I feel like I've wasted my time reading through this because I haven't really learned anything of particular interest to me. So this is what we want to avoid when we are writing our own literature reviews. So the solution is to ask a lot of critical questions. And we looked at this a little bit in the last session, and I know that there has been a session on reading journal articles, for instance, so this might be a little bit of a refresher. But basically, we always want to ask critical questions of the individual studies that we are researching and writing about, because this will help to establish a foundation for critique so that we can start inserting a sense of our analytical voice into the text that we are producing. So we're going to ask questions about the credibility of the work, the significance of the work, the methodology used, the data, the results, conclusions, all of those different elements. But we also want to ask how studies relate to each other. So how can we cluster them? How does one build on the other? Are the same researchers conducting similar studies, or do you have lots of different researchers from lots of different areas studying the same thing? How do these studies connect, basically? So, what might be an advantage of approaching the literature review in a more thematic way? What might be an advantage of this approach? Again, we'll take 2 or 3 minutes and contribute in the chat. So we're still looking at the acoustic environment and those monkeys, but we've just organized the information in a different way. Once again, we have some really fantastic and a lot of emphasis on the effect on the reader. It becomes more interesting. I mean, we can be honest, this topic might not be personally interesting to you. However, we might be a little bit more motivated to continue reading in contrast with the first example. I really like this description. It gives us a direction and makes the reader intrigued. So we have a much more confident framing of the topic. We are being eased into this research area. We're being provided a little bit of information so that we start to appreciate why this might be something we worth caring about, basically. And then we are taking the different studies and we're comparing them, we're contrasting them. They're not just sort of separate entries in almost what really looked like a bit of a listing approach. So this is what we want to strive for, because not only is it going to demonstrate that we are much more confident in our writing, but it's also going to demonstrate that we have a more complex appreciation of the topic. And in doing so, we're going to earn the trust of our reader a little bit more readily in contrast with that first structure. If we look at this a little bit more closely, we really do have a greater sense of voice. So we have a sense of an author shaping this information that they have engaged with. And in doing so, the readers are gaining a lot. They're gaining an appreciation of the complexity of that ongoing conversation, of that broader academic conversation. So we want to always think as much as possible thematically, because it's also going to generate what's known as synthesis. And synthesis is really essential if we want to be effective academic writers, because it helps demonstrate our understanding of themes, trends, and relationships across multiple studies, our ability to identify similarities and differences across those studies, and also it's going to then allow us to more convincingly present our research project in relation to this larger academic conversation. If we were to look at synthesis a little bit more closely, we might look at these two samples. Of the two, which do you prefer and why? So the first one reads, Baptiste reviewed 85 instances of elderly women who experienced hip fractures following falls. He determined that in the majority of cases, these falls were preventable. Beyond the physiological impact of these falls, the cost associated with such injuries was significant. Adams also studied instances of elderly women experiencing hip fractures in her study. According to her research, most of these falls were preventable. In 2018, Statistics Canada released a report on the costs associated with bone fractures in elderly populations, which often result in expensive hospitalizations. These injuries are often caused by falls and are largely preventable. Sample 2. Bone fractures in elderly populations are commonly associated with falls, the majority of which are preventable. Costs associated with bone fractures are significant, as these injuries are responsible for costly hospital stays. Which do you prefer and why? Emerging preference for that second sample. As noted, we do lose a little bit of detail and from the first sample. And this is always a judgment that you will make as a writer. You're always going to be determining when a reader requires more or less information. But one of the main benefits of thinking about writing from this perspective of synthesis is that it will often allow us to be more concise with our writing. And especially if you are working within a situation where you have limited word counts, you sometimes have to write with this conciseness in mind. Often, the reason why we might gravitate toward that second sample is simply it improves the reading experience. We have less repetition that we have to navigate as readers, and yet most of the same information is being captured. It's simply being captured via those citations rather than each and every study being referenced in detail. Now, often what we'll see in text is that when a topic is being introduced, for instance, there will be an introduction framed as via synthesis, and then we might decide to highlight a particular study. So if we wanted to highlight one to which is a conventional example, we would use that to be representative of other similar studies. Alternately, we might decide to highlight one that is quite different in some way, maybe because it used a very different methodology or it had a very different finding attached to it. So we get to make those decisions in order to frame our understanding of the topic at hand. So one of our last questions to ask today, what kind of questions could we ask to generate synthesis? Now, the hint is we want to think about the relationships between studies. So let's take a minute or two and contribute in the chat. Typing away, do feel free to keep typing. Again, lots of really great suggestions coming in. It's been a really great group, lots of participation in our session today. We're as a lot of the comments and suggested questions suggest, we're really looking at points of comparison. So how similar, how different? Do people agree? Do they disagree? Do they use similar or different methodology to investigate a comparable question? And that's what we're looking at when we are looking at synthesis. It's all about how similar or different some of these studies might be from one another. So are researchers asking similar or different questions about the same topic? Do the scholars agree? Do they contradict each other? What debates are emerging, basically? Do researchers interpret data in similar or different ways? So if they're actually drawing on the same data set, for instance, but are they coming to the same conclusions? And if they aren't, what accounts for this point of difference? Are they using different methodologies to investigate comparable questions? If so, what's the rationale for that? What are the implications of it? How are scholars responding to previous research? How does the research fit into the current academic conversation? What references are they drawing on? What other studies are they drawing on in order to frame their own research question? So these sort of questions will help us to really think about how we might place those studies in relation to one another. One of the ways in which we might demonstrate synthesis, apart from making use of those clustered citations, is to make use of language in an intentional way. So we might make use of these sort of linking words to signal either similarity or dissimilarity. So words like similar, likewise, both, also, comparable, related, etc., etc. That's going to communicate that these studies relate to each other in a specific way. But if we want to signal that point of contrast, we can use words like contrary, on the other hand, in contrast, unlike, but, while, however, although, etc., etc. If you're not familiar with this resource, I often recommend it. It's called the Academic Phrase Bank, hosted by the University of Manchester. And they have really great sentence frames if you're looking to shore up and develop your academic vocabulary. So I want to just quickly revisit one of our earlier examples, the one with the monkeys, in order to look at synthesis in action. So what we see here, I've highlighted the different sources that are being referenced. And what we see is really a beautiful rainbow emerging. And this shows how broad the scope of the research is, because we are drawing on multiple studies, especially when we're establishing that initial context at within the first paragraph. If we break this down a little bit more closely, we also see some of the language being used in a very deliberate way. So phrases like a small number of studies or all of these, this is helping to introduce that general scope of research to the reader in the first couple of sentences of the review. Oops. Next, we have reference to some studies have shown this finding differs from. This is adding some complexity to that academic conversation, really starting to engage with that sense of comparison, where there is agreement and where there is disagreement among scholars. Here we have an example where we are starting to signal a specific study in order to provide a little bit more detail. And this is usually done to reinforce a particular point. Again, either to signal something as representative or as an outlier that might change our initial understanding. So signaling words like for instance or in related research, that is sort of a prompt that alerts us to the fact that we're going to get more detail about a specific study in that sentence. And then these findings call into question. This sort of phrasing is going to help lead into some critical analysis. Basically, how are we using the references to build new ideas and insights? And what we want to do always is to make use of language. Oops, sorry. To signal critique and engagement. We want to make use of language in a deliberate way to demonstrate that we are critically engaged with the studies that we have been reading. So if we want to be critical, we can use some of these phrases. The authors present a plausible case for, less convincing is, the authors must be commended. Unfortunately, this study is an ambitious undertaking. It's not entirely successful. The research suffers from, can be criticized for. So we want to make use of language in order to demonstrate how engaged we are with the topic at hand, and to signal that we recognize that not all studies, that there basically is no perfect study. And so we are free to interrogate them and ask about their shortcomings. And in doing so, that sometimes provides justification for our own research. So I just wanted to quickly wrap up. So again, literature reviews help to justify our research. Making use of that CARS structure can make the justification a little bit easier. Making use of a thematic organization helps to improve readability and promote synthesis. And we strive for synthesis because it helps demonstrate higher order thinking and also starts to communicate your point of view as a researcher. And throughout our text, we want to make use of language to strategically guide and engage our readers. So next steps I would suggest, start looking at literature reviews in your field, especially if you're interested in publishing in the future, and look at how they are being organized. Are the authors making use of CARS moves, for instance, or are they making use of a different structure? How are they synthesizing the research of others in their literature reviews? You also want to take awareness of the language that they're using in order to determine how they are signaling critique and to determine if you want to use similar phrasing in your own work. So read for style as well as content to help train yourself in your own development as a writer, and think about how you can develop your genre awareness in order to meet the deliverable expectations. This is a skill that goes far beyond academia, as you need to become more comfortable writing text for different contexts. So a couple of recommended resources, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak on this topic. Just a few reminders of the different services and supports that are available at the library. And thanks again so much for having me today. I'm happy to stick around if there are any questions, or you could always send me an email, jill.mcmillan@usask.ca.
Jill, that was fantastic. I always learn so much, and especially at the end towards the phrasing. You know which phrasing to use, and that academic phrase bank from Manchester. I'm going to make sure that I put that in a sure email so that you all have a link to that. I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you very much, and then you can stick around and ask questions. Thanks again, Jill, for being with us today.